presenti oggi. Mi presento, sono Katy Crisetic, consigliera del Comune di San Pietro al Natisone con delega ai gemellaggi. Nel caso specifico sono la responsabile per il progetto europeo che stiamo per avviare e sarò per tutto il periodo la vostra referente. Come sapete, i comuni di San Pietro al Natisone come capofila del progetto e di Sambreville come comune gemellato hanno aderito al progetto europeo Cittadini per l'Europa, cofinanziato dall'Unione Europea. Il tema principale del progetto è la celebrazione del 70° anniversario della Schuman Declaration del 9 maggio 1950 e la sua attualizzazione nel contesto di un processo di maggiore integrazione. Il programma si svilupperà nell'arco di 21 giorni a partire dal 20 del 4 al 9 del 5 e prevede il coinvolgimento di più di 100 studenti, di cui 55 provenienti da Sambreville, più insegnanti ed autorità. Le attività progettuali da sviluppare si svolgeranno in parte online e in parte in presenza, come segue: 5 webinar coordinate da esperti che sono stati scelti insieme ad ISIG, Istituto di Sociologia Internazionale, per i 5 assi di temi prioritari del progetto: economia, sicurezza e controllo, fiducia nelle istituzioni, ambiente e educazione. Gemellaggio in presenza a San Pietro al Natisone nelle giornate del 7, 8, 9 con workshop sulle tematiche precedentemente discusse nei webinar. Evento finale con creazione da parte degli studenti del manifesto sul futuro dell'Europa. Ogni comune del progetto, rappresentato da una delegazione di studenti partecipanti, porterà le proprie istanze e riflessioni sulle tematiche in oggetto davanti alle autorità locali dei suddetti comuni. I webinar verranno registrati e pubblicati successivamente sul canale YouTube dedicato del Comune e potranno essere ascoltate dalle persone indirettamente coinvolte nel progetto. Dal 7 maggio al 9 maggio tutti gli studenti belgi e locali, più di 100 studenti, saranno impegnati nelle sedi appositamente scelte presso il nostro comune in delle workshop interattive per discutere insieme ai relatori di ISIG degli argomenti precedentemente trattati durante le webinar. L'ultimo giorno del progetto verrà firmato dalle autorità istituzionali presenti un manifesto per l'Europa preparato dagli studenti partecipanti al programma e che riassumerà a brevi punti il lavoro svolto e gli obiettivi raggiunti dal progetto. Tutte le attività del progetto saranno disseminate sui social, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube e pagina dei 2 comuni coinvolti. Nel rispetto della privacy chiediamo a tutti i ragazzi di tenere le videocamere oscurate e il microfono spento, attivandolo solo in caso di richieste di interventi. Bonjour à tous et merci d'être présents aujourd'hui. Je me présente, je suis Katy Crisetic, conseillère de la municipalité de San Pietro al Natisone, en charge du jumellage. Dans ce cas précis, je suis la personne en charge du projet européen que nous sommes sur le point de démarrer et je serai votre interlocuteur pendant toute la période. Comme vous savez, les communes de San Pietro al Natisone en tant que chef de projet et de Sambreville en tant que commune jumelée vont collaborer pour le développement du projet européen Citoyens pour l'Europe, cofinancé par l'Union européenne. Le thème principal du projet est la célébration du 70e anniversaire de la déclaration Schuman, 9 mai 1950, et son actualisation dans le cadre d'un processus de plus grande intégration. Le programme se déroulera sur 21 jours du 24 au 9-5 et implique l'implication de plus de 100 élèves, dont 55 de Sambreville, plus enseignants et autorités. Les activités du projet à développer se dérouleront en partie en ligne et en partie en personne comme suit. 5 webinaires coordonnés par des experts qui ont été choisis par l'aide de ISIG, Institut de Sociologie Internationale, pour les 5 axes prioritaires du projet: économie, sécurité et frontières, confiance dans les institutions, environnement, éducation. Extrait du livre blanc sur l'avenir de l'Europe. Jumelage en présence à San Pietro al Natisone les jours 7, 8, 9 mai avec des ateliers sur les sujets précédemment abordés dans les webinaires. Événement final avec la création par les étudiants du manifeste sur l'avenir de l'Europe. Chaque commune du projet, représentée par une délégation d'étudiants participants, apportera ses propres demandes, réflexions sur les enjeux en question devant les autorités locales des communes précitées. Les webinaires seront enregistrés et publiés ultérieurement sur la chaîne YouTube dédiée de la municipalité et pourront être écoutés par les personnes indirectement impliquées dans le projet. Du 7 mai au 9 mai, tous les étudiants belges et locaux, plus de 100 étudiants, seront engagés dans les lieux spécialement choisis de notre commune, dans les ateliers interactifs pour discuter avec les intervenants de ISIG des sujets précédemment abordés lors des webinaires. Le dernier jour du projet verra la présentation d'un manifeste qui sera signé par les autorités institutionnelles et précédemment préparé par les étudiants participant au programme et qui résumera en bref point le travail effectué, les objectifs atteints par le projet. Toutes les activités du projet seront diffusées sur les réseaux sociaux, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube et sur la page des 2 communes concernées. Dans le respect de la privacy, nous demandons à tous les étudiants de garder les télécaméras sombres et le microphone éteint en ne l'activant qu'en cas de demande d'intervention. Je vous souhaite une très bonne écoute et je vous laisse dans les mains de notre expert qui suivra le webinaire en langue anglaise. Ok, può partire. Dottore, che io non sento, credo che abbia il microfono spento.
I beg your pardon. Good morning. Good morning. First of all, I would like to introduce myself before starting with today's webinar. My name is Ezio Benedetti. I am a lecturer, professor. I was a visiting professor for many years also in European universities on EU law and EU policies matters. So I have been, I'm pleased that I have been involved by the organizers in this project, and I would like to thank particularly Ms. Krizetic for the help and the support she gave me during the organization of these 2 meetings, because we will have another meeting on economic matters tomorrow. I think, before starting with today's topic, which is related to security and borders, that these kind of projects are of paramount importance in not only building trust and confidence, but especially knowledge in youth, in young generations about what Europe is and what especially the future of Europe can be. And this is even more valid, in my opinion, in these moments we are all living, where the European construction, the European integration process seems somehow facing difficult moments when it comes to defining its role in future international relations. I would like to stress by this point of view that, in my opinion, Europe was, is, and probably will be also in the future a work in progress. Europe is flexible, is adaptable, and this is showed by the many crises somehow Europe went through during its more than 60 years of history. One of the last crises we can remember is that of the Brexit, but there were many others which somehow put Europe in a difficult situation, but at the very end helped Europe to develop its own vision, its own policies, and especially to represent itself like a valid alternative to a bipolar world, and to represent somehow an idea of what and how humankind could develop in peace and solidarity. So, starting from these brief considerations, I prepared for today a presentation. I will share it with you, obviously, now, which is quite articulated. Obviously, when we discuss about security and borders, these 2 dimensions encompass different approaches. It's not only about legal provisions which are related to the control of external and internal borders, as we will see, of the European Union, but this dimension is also related to a wider geopolitical approach that Europe has, or has not, we will see when this happens or not, related to the rest of the world. I mean, how Europe opens itself to third countries, to different dimensions. Obviously, we live in a globalized war. We can see it in a globalized world, sorry. And we can see these in these difficult moments when it comes to the war in Ukraine. War in Ukraine, in my opinion, well represents this tension between a globalized world where multipolarism, I mean, the sharing of experiences, the sharing also of interest, is somehow opposed to a bipolar world, to a world where national interest and somehow some practices which were typical of the 19th and 20th century seem still alive, despite the fact, I repeat it, that we live in, especially by an economic point of view, globalized world. Now, I will start sharing my presentation. Obviously, if there are questions, or if someone, as Ms. Crisetti said, wants to intervene, your interventions and your reflections are more than welcome. One more thing, today's webinar obviously doesn't want to be an exhaustive representation of what migration policy or of what border management in Europe is. It wants rather, starting from the white paper of 2017 on the future of Europe, to represent some possible scenarios how to develop this border management, and aims to highlight which are the main problems and unsolved issues which are still somehow representing border and security dimension in Europe. 1 second only just to start the presentation, and I will share it with you. Okay, let me know. I think should be visible. So today's topic is about security and borders in the European Union. I would like to stress two main things when we start introducing this quite wide and quite complex topic. Security is a wide concept. It includes different dimensions somehow. Security is about social security. Security is about economic security. Security is about military security. But security is especially in this case about human security. How do we perceive our participation in the European project by the point of view of security? This is the question we will try to give an answer today. So I'm trying to, sorry, 1 second only. Okay. The white paper on the future of Europe has been presented, as you know, in March 2017. It has been prepared by the European Commission during the Rome summit, celebrating the 60 years from the Treaties of Rome, when the process of EU integration started. This comprehensive document presents 5 possible scenarios on the future of Europe, starting from the idea that European integration has always been a dynamic process. As I already told you, Europe can be defined as a work in progress, and Europe has always been at a crossroads and has always adapted and evolved. This is a very important thing when we talk about today's topic, and it's something that we have to keep well in mind when we consider the white paper as a document which can give us some scenarios related to the future of Europe. Today's webinar, as I told you, will focus on the reflections and scenarios proposed by the white paper related to the security and borders. We will try to understand if these scenarios are still valid today after the breakup of the war in Ukraine and in current geopolitical circumstances. And we will try to introduce some additional reflections which can help us understanding where the EU is at the moment and where the EU will go in the near future when it comes to security and borders. As mentioned in the foreword of the white paper, security is one of the main challenges the EU will face in the near future. And security is directly linked to the role that Europe will need to play in an increasingly multipolar world. So when we think to security, we don't have to limit the concept of security to our own security, to the fact that maybe we feel insecure in our cities, that maybe we feel insecure in certain environments. Security, by this point of view, is a wider concept, as I've already told you. And so we have to consider security also when it comes to international crises like Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen. All of these crises are somehow directly or indirectly affecting our security. So security is not only about borders, but it's a larger concept. Think about frozen enlargements and security at external borders. It's about 25 years, even more in the case of Turkey, that the European Union is dealing with a possible enlargement to the Western Balkan countries, to former Yugoslav countries plus Albania. Can be Ukraine a push factor by this point of view? Will this enlargement somehow affect our security? A possible entry of Ukraine when the war will end, hopefully soon, in the EU can somehow change our perception of security. These are all aspects we have to take in account. Second consideration I would relate to this wider concept that security is not only about borders. Think about the tensions at EU's eastern borders, the continuous war, the terrorism in Middle East and Africa. As clearly stated in the white paper, this somehow implies a progressive militarization around a war. And these are clear images of a tense global context. I will quote now the white paper when it says that the need to reflect on how to deter, respond, and protect against threats ranging from large-scale cyber attacks to more traditional forms of aggression has never been so critical. So once again, security is really something that involves all our lives and involves our lives in a very wide, by a very wide point of view. By this point of view, we must pose a question now. What is the international role of the European Union? Obviously, this is quite a complex question. Many analysts and many scholars are quite cautious and are quite skeptical, we must say, about the potential international role of the EU, in the sense that many have defined the European Union as an economic giant and a political dwarf, in the sense that the European Union, and this is unfortunately quite clear also at the moment, is very often unable to express a single position when it comes to big geopolitical questions. Nevertheless, the European Union is able somehow to influence the geopolitical dimension in a wider sense. So NATO, obviously, as clearly stated in the white paper, will continue to provide hard security for most of EU countries. But Europe cannot be naive and has to take care of its own security. This is clearly stated in the white paper, and this clearly emerges in the last 2 to 5 years, I would say, in European politics. There are more and more attempts to foster a European defense system, to create a more integrated approach to what European defense is. So being a soft power somehow, which means being one of the biggest international donors when it comes to development cooperation, is probably no longer powerful enough when force can prevail over rules. Obviously, there is a risk when we decide not to use soft power only, but hard power too. This can somehow imply the fact that we will face an opponent sooner or later. But I would like to stress one more thing, that too often NATO and Europe are considered by many analysts and normal citizens as the same thing. They are not. They are two distinct international organizations, two completely distinct structures, which are somehow integrated when it comes to their political goals. But nevertheless, NATO is not the EU, and EU is not NATO. A clear point is that EU is missing a European system of defense, a consistent European defense system. So most of the European Union countries, most of the European Union members are somehow forced to rely on NATO for their own defense. So the questions are, which are the options for the EU? How to guarantee that the rule of law will continue to replace and prevail on the rule of iron, as stated in the white paper. I would say that we can start from the next slide. I mentioned already that European Union is the biggest donor in the world. European Union, these are updated data. The data which are in the white paper are from 2017. These data are from 2021. In 2021, European Union is still the biggest donor in the world, despite the COVID pandemic. So 75.2 billion euros were dedicated to official development assistance, 55.2% share of the all money donated in the world to development assistance, more than double than the US, and you can see how the others are far away. Why this approach can be important? Because nevertheless, soft power is a power. We cannot disregard the fact that official development assistance helps not only the countries which are receiving this assistance, but help also Europe to, I would not say to acquire influence in these countries, but somehow to be able to influence the democratic processes within these countries, the rule of law process, and somehow help the transition within these countries, avoiding internal conflicts and then new wars. Some analysts and some scholars, and also many politicians in the EU, are now convinced that this is not sufficient, that this is not enough. And this is clearly demonstrated by the next graph I will show you. This is also an updated graph, not the one you will find in the white paper. Here, it clearly emerges that expenses for defense are rising, and projected 2030 spending is almost double. And this table, this is 2021. This will probably change now into 2022 with the Ukrainian war. So we have two faces of the same coin. On one side, the EU is the biggest donor in development assistance to third countries. On the other hand, Europe is increasing its own expenses, generally speaking, on defense. So we cannot disregard these two faces of the coin. And obviously, it's up to politics to decide which road to take clearly. Continuing on our reasoning, the next question is still Europe a continent of peace? Somehow, is Europe giving us the idea, the feeling that we still live in a continent of peace as it has been for more than 60 years? According to the Global Peace Index 2020, this is still true. I also updated a table which was included in the white paper 2017. Europe is still a remarkably free and stable place where to live, especially if we look at a world which is still full of discord, division, wars, conflicts. And still, as it was in 2017, this is still valid in 2021, and will be probably still valid, let's see, hopefully in 2022. Out of the 25 countries listed as the most peaceful in the world, 15 are from the EU. Now, starting from this very general consideration, what does the EU do when it comes to security? How the white paper scenarios developed so far? These are the two next questions we will try to give an answer. So when it comes to security, we must first of all mention the European security strategy and the internal security strategy, which were adopted in 2000, respectively in 2018 and in 2019 by the European Commission, which are direct efforts to make Europe more secure by fighting especially terrorism and serious crime. These were and still are considered as two of the most serious threats to internal security of Europe, of the European Union. So how to do this? By strengthening cooperation on law enforcement between member states, by fostering common border management, and we will focus on this aspect in a while, because this is directly connected, obviously, to the main topic of today's webinar, borders and security. But this somehow includes also civil protection. Think about climate change, natural disaster, and obviously related to disaster management. All these aspects are somehow included in these two strategies, and they are analyzed in details, and solutions or approaches are suggested by these two strategies to the member states. So the objectives of these two strategies can be summarized as follows. First, to prevent and fight terrorism, including the phenomenon of foreign fighters. Second, to combat international organized crime more effectively by deepening cross-border police cooperation. And you see how borders here are a relevant matter to be considered. Third, to enhance the competitiveness of Europe's security industry and for security. Never forget that Europe has been and still somehow is first an economic integration hub. So the economic dimension is always and has always been and still is at the center of European Union's reasoning. This is even valid when it comes to security. And fourth objective of these two strategies is to strengthen and coordinate controls of EU's external borders. So here I prepared a couple of slides. I will not go in details related to the legal basis of border management. What I would like to stress again, once again, is that also the legal dimension of border management and migration policy in the EU is a work in progress. And it's somehow strictly linked to the economic dimension of European integration. What is important to stress by this point of view is that the EU nowadays deals with immigration issues in the framework of a specific policy area, which is called Area of Freedom, Security and Justice. This area should guarantee the widest possible freedom of individuals, safeguarding the security and the respect for the rules of coexistence. Strictly legally speaking, these rules are now included in the Title 5, Chapter 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, related concerning policies on border checks, asylum, and immigrations. It's important to stress one thing. This is directly related to what I was telling you about the economic prevalence when it comes to the EU integration process. The Treaty of Rome did not contain provisions in the field of migration, border management, or whatsoever. But it included only provisions on the free movement of workers from the same member state. And this was valid until at least the end of the 70s, I would say. So the economic approach to the matter of migration prevailed. When the geographical origin of the workforce started to change, in the sense that immigration was not only internal to Europe, but started being a phenomenon, an external phenomenon, more immigrants from Africa, more immigrants from Asia, and so forth, community action starting being more related to security as we intended, in the sense that the community action aimed to prevent, aiming to prevent and repress illegal immigration, and at the same time to improve the conditions of workers coming from third countries, in the sense from outside the European Union, in order to guarantee them the equal treatment of European Union workers. So once again, you see that the attention to the security dimension related to borders is strictly related to an economic approach to migration management. The general sense of what I'm trying to tell you is that the abolition of internal controls provided by Schengen, something that we give for granted today, needs a precondition: the strengthening of controls at the external borders. And here is where security enters in our analysis. So 1985 Schengen Agreement, the first group of states decide to progressively abolish controls and checks at the borders internally. 1990 Schengen Convention, the checks are progressively lifted and some mechanisms of cooperation between border police and so on are introduced. The Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System. The system evolves. From Schengen 1990, we arrive to Amsterdam, and the Schengen area progressively expands. Nowadays, as I told you, we give the Schengen area in most of the European countries as granted. 26 are the members currently of the Schengen area. Not all of them are EU members because Schengen is still external, as we jurists say, to the EU acquis strictly intended, in the sense that it's a convention, it's a treaty, it's an agreement which is parallel to the European integration. So the agreement and the convention, as well as the related agreements and rules, formed the so-called Schengen acquis and were finally integrated into the framework of the European Union thanks to the 1999 Amsterdam Treaty, which communitarized finally immigration policy. So we can say that from its origins in the 50s up to the end of the 20th century, 1999, the EU didn't have an immigration policy. Immigration policy is the product of the process of integration on one side, and especially by an economic point of view. And it's a product of the necessity, the need of European member states to somehow start managing the migration flows coming outside Europe, so from third countries. The situation slightly changed up to today from Amsterdam to Lisbon. Lisbon is the last treaty which is now in force, which has been adopted in 2009, and which is including this Schengen acquis as we defined it, and somehow defines, and this is very important, the paramount importance of the European Council as the main institution dealing with immigration. Why is this important? Because the European Council is the political body of the Union, is the body which decides the strategic approach. It's not the body which guarantees the functioning of the European Union. It's not the administrative body, it's the political body, where the heads of state, the head of government of the member state sit and take the strategic decision. It is relevant that also in Lisbon, these matters are not completely communitarized. They are not transferred to the Commission, to the Council, to the Parliament. Yes, they have a role, but the main role is still in the hand of the European Council, which defines the strategic guidelines for the legislative and operational planning within the area of freedom, security, and justice. So security, border management, migrations are all topics which are still in the hands of politics as we traditionally intended. They are not fully communitarized in the sense that they are managed by the Commission and by a structure which cannot directly be related to the member states. Let's try, I just gave you a very wide overlook somehow of the evolution of the legal provisions and rules related to security and borders. Now, I will try to focus a bit more on what the white paper says and on the scenarios that the white paper gives us related to security and borders. Obviously, I extrapolated many of these approaches and most of the possible scenarios from the white paper, even if I tried to adapt it to the current situation. So, according to the white paper, when we deal with security and borders, we are referring at quoting, the increasingly blurred lines between internal and external threats, which are changing the way people think about personal safety and borders. Think about this. This is a question to each one of you. What is for you security? What is for you feel secure? Stay in your home, having external threats, being safe from terrorism? Do you perceive migrants as a threat to your well-being, or do you see them as an opportunity? How pandemic affected your own lives? It's again about security. Obviously, a war will affect your own security, but think about yourself as individuals. How the war in Ukraine can somehow directly affect your own security. All these are aspects that the white paper is dealing with. So, it's a matter of fact, perhaps, if we talk about migrations, that migrations changed in the last 20 to 25 years. There are different flows. There are flows from Eastern Europe, now obviously related to refugees coming from Ukraine, escaping the war, but there are still flows from Asia, again, refugees escaping from wars and conflicts, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and many others. And then there is Africa. Many economic migrants are coming from Africa, but also many others are escaping, again, from conflicts and wars. So, which are the key factors related to migrations, and how these key factors can be somehow addressed in order to feel more secure? The key factors are quite clear: population growth, widespread tensions and conflicts, but also climate change. So you see how our personal individual security is directly affected by global processes where we cannot intervene directly, but which are directly affecting our lives. And so once again, participation, sharing problems, discussing problems, sharing views, it's extremely important if you want somehow also to ensure our own security. A question which is very often on the newspapers in these days is, what changed from the 2015 refugee crisis, 1.2 million people escaping mostly from Syria and coming to Europe, to 2022 Ukrainian war? In the sense that now no one has doubts about the need to help Ukrainian refugees, to provide them with a shelter, with food, with help. But this was not true in 2015, if you remember, if some of you remember that events. In 2015, most of European citizens, there are some surveys where about 45% of European citizens were quite rather skeptic about letting these refugees in. But what is the difference between a refugee escaping from Syria, from a war, terrible war as the one in Ukraine is, and then a Ukrainian refugee? So you see how our perception of security shifts, changes. Obviously, this has led to a debate about solidarity and responsibility. And these are two key elements, two key arguments, two key words, solidarity and responsibility, which should guide member states in the clear and consistent definition of border management when it comes to migration, when it comes to refugees, when it comes to asylum seekers, when it comes to security. At the same time, guaranteeing the free movement of people according to the Schengen acquis within Europe. And we cannot disregard that COVID-19 pandemic impacted this dimension too. Temporary controls, if you remember, were reintroduced in 2019 and 2020, in 2020 and 2021, at certain borders within Europe, even between countries that were and are part of the Schengen area. So, what we should ask ourselves, we are strongly convinced that Schengen is a good thing because it allows us to circulate within Europe freely, to travel, to study, to work in a third country. But at the very end, external borders of the EU are still a reality. So are borders a thing of the past? And how to answer to this very complicated question when it comes to the European Union? There are two different dimensions we must take in account when we refer at borders in the EU. The internal borders, which are mostly open, despite some shortcomings and deficiencies related to the COVID, as I just mentioned you, but which are guaranteed by the Schengen Convention, which allows all EU citizens to travel freely within European Union borders, or at least within the borders of the states who are part of the Schengen Convention. Most of the European Union member states are part of it. And the external borders dimension. So which are the differences between these two dimensions? Which are the differences between internal and external borders? We will see it in a while. But now, for now, it's important to stress that the geographical demarcation of the respective borders still is an exclusive competence of the member states. Again, we go back to what I was telling you about the important role of the European Council. Border management is a political matter. Border management is considered by the states, even by the member states of the European Union, as integrant part of their sovereignty, of the right they have to control their borders. So everything is done to cooperate, to share, to be solidar, is done only on political basis. So if there is no political agreement, there is no cooperation on this matter. And the political agreement must be unanimous. This is clearly stated by a specific article of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the last version, which is now in force, at Article 77, where it's clearly said that the geographical demarcation of the borders is an exclusive competence of the member states. So the Commission, the Parliament, or the European Union as such cannot influence these political decisions. To explain a bit more about some critical issues I already introduced before. So, the European Union has always considered migration flows in more economic terms than in political terms, because this was and still is in the competencies of the member states. So the European Union was careful to the entry of workers and labor, in other terms, to the labor market. But what is missing by a political point of view? The European Union is still lacking a common asylum system. We have 27 different systems, which are so only partly integrated. There is still, even if some progresses were made in the last few years, a rather weak cooperation on migration issues and border controls. It's a matter of fact that migration flows always existed as temporary or permanent movement of individuals or groups from one place to another, from one country to another. But what changed with the new millennium is that the migratory phenomenon took on a global character, both from the point of view of the migrant flows and of the territories concerned. And the paradox is that EU member states are still responding to this global challenge individually, not jointly. So internal and external borders. The abolition of internal checks is clear. Schengen. As I told you, this needs a precondition to function, the strengthening of controls at external borders. I told you that currently the Schengen area is made up of 26 European countries, including 22 EU states. So there are 4 states which are out of this system. They will probably enter soon, but still out. When we talk about Schengen, I repeat it once more, it means that there aren't checks at the internal borders. Perhaps you can pass freely from the border cross of Ventimiglia to Menton in France without any check control. These are 2 Schengen states. But if you go from Slovenia, perhaps, to Croatia, Croatia is not yet part of the Schengen, it will probably enter soon, you must present your ID and you are submit to border checks and controls. Why? Because Slovenia, even if Croatia is a member of the European Union, is considered the external border of the EU Schengen area. So there are, according to clearly defined criteria, some harmonized checks at external borders. In other terms, the borders, as I told you, between a Schengen state and a non-Schengen state. And as a result, both EU citizens and third country nationals can move freely within the Schengen area and are only subject to checks at external borders. This is why the European Union as such and countries, member countries of the European Union, decided to somehow enforce, foster their cooperation when it comes to external borders in order to guarantee the security within the internal borders. In the sense that once an individual enters the Schengen area, he is not subject to controls anymore. He can freely circulate from Paris to Berlin to Milano. How to guarantee the security of citizens? So, the security of citizens can be guaranteed according to the white paper in different manners when it comes to security and borders. According to the different scenarios which are introduced by this very important document, more, as the document itself says, as a way to reason about the future of Europe and what is the future of Europe we want. Obviously, the white paper starts from one basic and fundamental precondition, which is that the EU 27 will remain united. So there will not be additional Brexits. Obviously, otherwise these scenarios would not work. But let's say that these 5 scenarios shift from not only more or less European Union, but they shift from different and interlaced dimensions of what is the European Union we want in the future. In the sense that more can be less or less can be more. I will quote here, I quoted here in the presentation as well, a very important, 2 very important sentences which are included in the white paper. Many of the profound transformations Europe is currently undergoing are inevitable, are irreversible. And this is a matter of fact. Think about climate change. Okay? Others are harder to predict and will come unexpectedly. It was 2017. Think about the COVID. Europe can either be carried by those events or it can seek to shape them. And this is very important to say what? That Europe as an European Union as institutions, member states as the basis of these institutions, but also with citizens must share a vision, a strategy of what we believe Europe should be in the near future. And this is valid also when it comes to security and borders. So, continuing on this reasoning, I would like now to introduce you each of the 5 scenarios, relating it to security and border, but security in a wider sense, not only security related to borders management in the sense that threats which can come from terrorism, organized crime, which enters into the Schengen area, crossing the external borders, but also security in the wider sense, as I introduced it at the beginning of today's webinar, related to defense, related to the need for Europe to develop its own defense capabilities, not depending necessarily only from NATO, perhaps, as an institution. By this point of view, I would like to stress these are somehow academic considerations. You are mostly young students, so but it's important to understand that we have the states. The states are complex organizations, which are, there are thousands of definitions what a state is, but generally speaking, are complex organizations which are pursuing their own interests. Very often these interests coincide, are common, so they decide to cooperate. And how to cooperate better than creating another organization, a structure, which we call international organizations, to share these interests, to transfer competencies from the national level, from the state level, to the international level, to the international organization, which will deal with these competencies in name of the states who transferred the same competencies to the organization. So the European Union is still nothing else than an international organization with extremely relevant competencies, with a great power in certain domains, like the economic one, as we will see tomorrow, with a much weaker approach to other domains, like defense, like foreign policy. This is under the eyes of all of us as European citizens when it comes to the Ukrainian crisis. It's quite and rather difficult to see, okay, yes, all the member states are united in condemning Putin aggression, but not every day we see a common statement by the European member states saying we want to terminate the war doing this and that. So very often each foreign office, each Ministry of Foreign Affairs is giving his or her own view on how to terminate the war. The voice of the European Union on these matters is still weak, and it's a matter of fact. We will have to face on that. So starting from this consideration, starting from the fact that the European Union is an international organization with huge competencies and relevant powers, but not in the field of defense and foreign affairs, that there are some policies like the migration policy which are still somehow sensitive to the member states, and this is why the member states are not willing to transfer completely these competencies at the European level. How the scenarios highlighted by the white paper can be included in these two general considerations when it comes to borders and security. So, the first scenario highlighted in the white paper is the so-called scenario carrying on. So what can happen to security and borders up to 2025, according to this scenario? According to this scenario, the European Union focuses on delivering its positive reform agenda by adapting it to current threats and problems, but by pursuing a consistent cooperation and solidarity on these matters. How to apply these to security and borders? How this, let's say, positive approach or positive scenario could impact on security and borders open issues? Perhaps this would allow some progresses on speaking with one voice on foreign affairs. So the scenario carrying on implies a deeper cooperation in certain fields. And when it comes to security, it implies the fact that the member states will agree to have a more common foreign affairs policy, external policy, and also closer defense cooperation. And this would be obviously the next step, creating a EU army. Is this realistic? At the moment, I would say absolutely not, if we look at the current situation and at the level of international relations at the moment. It's an attempt which has been somehow included in the European agenda several times. Due to the opposition of most of the countries, we must say, it never became a reality. But if this scenario carrying on, in the sense that if all the 27 states agree to deepen their cooperation based on solidarity, this could become a reality. If you ask me, I would tell that this scenario, when it comes to foreign affairs and defense, is rather far away. Nevertheless, it can be an objective, and it's obviously related, once again, to the political dimensions. Are the member states willing to do so, by a political point of view, or are they not? Are we, European citizens, ready to accept this further step towards the creation of a truly European state? Because this would mean that what we defined as an international organization could evolve and could become something different. A sort of supranational European state, a federal structure, I don't know. But it's one of the possible scenarios. But obviously, it implies that the member states and the European Union will agree in be flexible, adapt their agenda to the threats and problems, and pursue a consistent and constant cooperation on these matters. When it comes to external borders, if this scenario carrying on becomes real, the cooperation in the management of external borders could be stepped up gradually. Some progresses towards a common asylum system would be finally possible. And this would allow an improved coordination on security matters too. Terrorism, organized crime, etc. Something has been done through Europol, perhaps, through Frontex, but this is not sufficient, this is not enough. Especially when we look at the fact, as I already told you, that the member states are mostly facing these threats individually through bilateral agreements, not using the European Union. Even if there is a certain level of cooperation when it comes to terrorism and organized crime, perhaps a common asylum system doesn't exist yet. And so each member state is dealing with its own rules, that which somehow in certain conditions coincide, but which in many other situations may differ. The second scenario, nothing but the single market. Obviously, in this scenario, the cooperation is weaker. The European Union focuses on the single market only, on its economic dimension, which is the very core, which is the engine somehow, as someone defined it, of the process of European integration since its origins. So the European Union focuses on the single market only and goes back to its economic integration roots, giving up from any political aspirations somehow, remaining an economic giant, but somehow accepting to be a political dwarf. In this scenario, there would not be agreement to foster a stricter cooperation on migration, on border controls, and common defense. And this is somehow what certain European countries are pursuing at the moment, with certain differences. Think about Hungary, but think also about Poland. or some stances given, some positions, sorry, expressed by the governments of Latvia recently, Estonia, and so on and so forth. So how would this scenario impact on security and borders open issues? First of all, if this scenario prevails, we will not have any single migration or asylum policy. Each country will continue to manage migration and asylum according only to their own rules, internal rules. Coordination on security would be dealt only bilaterally, not multilaterally. So through bilateral agreements, country A, country B. And the internal border controls would be probably reintroduced. So the Schengen area would be somehow weakened due to several considerations. When it comes to the broader concept of security related also to defense and to foreign policy, if this scenario, nothing but the single market prevail, some foreign policy issues would be increasingly dealt with bilaterally, not multilaterally. So, as it is happening, France would not consult with Brussels when it comes to an international crisis, whichever. Italy would not consult with Brussels, again, when an international crisis breaks up, which is somehow interesting, involving Italian interest, and so on and so forth. So all the progresses which were made, which are undoubtful in building a common foreign policy, would be stopped in the case that this scenario prevailed. And defense cooperation would remain as it is today, weak and inconsistent. Think about the different scenarios and think also according to your own sensitiveness, to your own vision of what Europe is. Where do you fit better? Where, in which of these 5 scenarios you think Europe would do better? And try to keep these answers for the workshops you will have in the frame of this project, as you know. The third scenario, those who want more do more. This is somehow an evolution of the first scenario carrying on, whereas the EU allows willing member states, some willing member states, to do more together in specific areas. In the 90s, this was called enforced cooperation, or I defined it with my students once, the coalition of the willing, in the sense that some member states, a limited group, could be willing to enhance their cooperation, to make it stricter, to put together some competencies, and to cooperate more strictly on certain policies, on specific policies. But this is obviously valid only for those states who agree. What is the risk? This has been already highlighted several years ago by some analysts, that we create European integration at 2 speeds. A group of states who go further in their cooperation, because they are willing to do it, there is the political interest and willingness to do it, and other states who are somehow on the back. They wait to see what's going on. Or maybe completely disagree on this approach. So how this third scenario, those who want more do more, impact on security and borders open issues? I would say that this is very similar, and you can find it obviously in the white paper, because there is a very interesting table at the end where all these different scenarios are crossed and interlaced. As in scenario 1, carrying on, progress is made on speaking with one voice on foreign affairs, but only for the group of states who will accept to do so. A closer defense cooperation for a limited group of states who agree in doing so would also be possible. Military coordination, joint equipment a limited European army. And again, when it comes to borders and security, as in scenario 1, carrying on, cooperation in the management of external borders is stepped up gradually. Progress towards a common asylum system, improved coordination on security matters, fight against terrorism, organized crime, etc., would be possible for a limited group of states who agree in doing so. So I would say that this scenario 3 is very similar in its results to scenario 1 when it comes to security and borders, but the effects are somehow limited to a certain group of states who accept to do so, to deepen their cooperation, their integration in these fields. And the others, as I told you, there is a big risk here to create a Europe at two speeds, where the others will remain on the back and may somehow at a certain point decide never to enter in this deepened cooperation system. Then we have the scenario 4, doing less more efficiently. This is somehow very interesting to me because it goes to somehow put together the need for more integration with the skepticism of those who say there is too much Europe. So it's not a paradox in the sense that debureaucratization of the European Union can be something very positive. But it must at the same time consider the fact that debureaucratization can allow to do things more efficiently and can even push in a long-term perspective for more Europe. The white paper says that the European Union in this scenario focuses on delivering more and faster in selected policy areas, while doing less elsewhere. By doing so, the EU acts quicker and more consistently in a chosen number of domains. So the difference with scenario 3 is that all the states participate to this approach, but the difference is that not all policies are involved, only a certain number of policies, only a certain number of domains. And let's make the hypothesis that security and borders are two of the domains which are within this scenario. How does this scenario impact on security and border open issues? There could be more stricter cooperation on border management, on asylum policies, and counterterrorism. All these cooperations would be more systematic. A European Defence Union is created when it comes to security and defense, and the EU would speak with one voice on foreign policy issues. I would say that this scenario is probably, to me, the less realistic, because I don't see how perhaps European Union member states who are already skeptic in having more Europe would accept to deepen their cooperation on security and borders and not to deepen it perhaps on economic and monetary issues. It's more an exercise of what Europe could be than a realistic approach. But it's needed, also this scenario, because help us by a methodological point of view to understand how Europe works. And Europe works by sectors, by policies. Again, political decisions on which policy, on which sector should be transferred from the national level to the European Union level is the core of this discussion. And then we have the fifth scenario, doing much more together. The European Union in this scenario decides to do much more together across all policy areas. So not only carrying on is something different. Carrying on means we go on, we see what's going on, and we adapt, which is the, I would say, typical. This was scenario 1, if you remember. The typical approach of the Union and of the European community before the Union since its early origins. It's the so-called communitarian method. With this approach, scenario 5, a stricter cooperation in all fields is required. And this means sharing more powers, decision-making processes in key areas. It's the most optimistic scenario, I would say, presented by the white paper, because the cooperation between all member states goes further than ever before in all domains. And how does, again, this scenario 5, doing much more together, could impact on security and borders open issues? We can say, again, two things: that as in scenario 4, cooperation on border management, asylum policies, and counterterrorism would be systematic and consistent. You see how crossed are these different scenarios and how many common things they have one with each other. It's only about different levels of integration and different ways how to pursue this integration. And again, as in scenario 4, the EU speaks with one voice on all foreign policy issues, and the European Defence Union is created. So, these are the 5 scenarios. These are the different approaches to security and borders according to the scenarios introduced by the white paper. But let's make some considerations. Let's make some reflections on security and borders to be further debated, maybe during workshops. These are mostly tips and ideas on how to deepen the discussion when it comes to border and security and when it comes to the white paper scenarios I just illustrated. We cannot disregard, it should be clear at this point, that borders and security are directly linked to EU policies. So, in the sense that if we don't have a consistent and clear EU policy, we cannot say that borders and security are integral part of the EU integration process. We focused our attention on borders control and migration flows, but we cannot disregard the fact that security and borders are directly related to the fight versus cross-border crime and terrorism. I already highlighted that. But remember that this is one of the main reasons why the states are now cooperating on these matters. Why? Because cross-border crime is by definition not national crime. And on the other hand, terrorism is an international phenomenon, which cannot be limited and is not limited anymore to a single state. So it's a matter of fact, again, that the EU helps its member countries to fight serious cross-border crime and terrorism through its own policies. And this is directly related to borders and security management of the borders. Not to allow terrorists to enter the EU through its external borders, and not allowing them to circulate within the EU internal borders, according to Schengen, as I already mentioned. The point is, are we willing to accept more security but less freedom of circulation in order to fight cross-border crime and terrorism? Is there a way between? Security at borders is crucial by this point of view, but is there any risk? Are we creating what someone defined fortress Europe? A free Europe outside and a closed Europe with high walls outside. So these are just some reflections, as I told you. But let's see which policies the EU adopted so far when it comes to borders and security, and it comes to a stricter management of borders and a stricter approach to security matters at all levels. First policy we must recall is that of customs and security. Customs-related security initiatives of the EU include the concept of authorized economic operator and security cooperation with non-EU countries, in the sense that EU has a common customs system. The customs are unified, okay? So to operate in the internal market, you must be an authorized economic operator, which implies the fact that you are submitted to a number of checks, being a third national, a third economic operator coming from a non-European countries, before being allowed to operate into the internal market. And this implies a strict cooperation also with non-EU countries to check if that specific company is under the control of organized crime or of terrorist organization, if it's not about money laundering, drug trafficking, etc. So cooperation on customs and security is fundamental. And what has been done, very important reform, is that of the authorized economic operator. All the member states are applying this, and if you want to sell your goods coming from Saudi Arabia rather than Nigeria, you have to satisfy certain criteria to be allowed to operate into the internal market. Law enforcement cooperations. Also in this field, something has been done. Europol has been created, which is a EU agency, which assists police forces in EU member countries, making it much easier for European police to organize and manage transnational investigations. They do joint actions, and there is a extremely well improved information exchange and operational cooperation system. I have a very good friend who works at Europol as a financial assistant, and he told me amazing things about how Europol works. It's really one of the agencies which probably made most progresses when it comes to this level of security and border analysis. The third policy where the EU is somehow active when it comes to security and borders is the so-called support for global security. It's a matter of fact that the EU is not only the biggest international donor, as I told you. Soft power is still very important when it comes to international diplomacy. Unfortunately, at the moment, not so important as hard power, but still somehow relevant and influential. So the support for global security of the EU is somehow part of this soft power expressed by the EU. In fact, the EU carries out a number of civilian and military missions worldwide under the common security and defense policy. The EU created, with the Treaty of Lisbon, a common security and defense policy, which is mainly intergovernmental. It has not been communitarized in the sense that it's not a direct competence of EU institutions, but still of the EU member states. But if there is unanimity, the member states are able to organize and participate to international military missions, peacekeeping operations, perhaps. And this is also very important because it can be represented and intended as a sort of precondition for a complete communitarization of the foreign policy and the realization of a new level of integration when it comes to foreign policy. Not less important is security industry. Also in this field, also in this specific sector, the EU developed a specific policy. So the European Commission contributes funding and works on harmonizing certification procedures for security technologies. The EU is the third world producer of security technologies, drones, alarm systems, and so on and so forth. The European Commission is funding this industry, and especially it made all what is possible to harmonize the certification procedures for this industry, allowing that a drone constructed in the UK has the same technical characteristic and responds to the same rules as a drone which has been built and constructed in Spain, perhaps. Much more should be done. Consider that security industry is one of the most multinational, transnational levels of cooperation, not only European among big industries. It's a huge economic sector growing enormously, and obviously directly related also to the defense sector. As you remember, I have told you that by 2030, the European Union member states, even if extremely far away from China, Russia, US, will almost double their expenses for defense. How to face this approach, which is mostly national, with the need for stricter cooperation on security and borders too, through this security industry policy, which could allow to have a truly European defense system and a functioning European Defense Agency, which is now existing but quite weak in its competencies. 4 more policies, which are more directly related to borders, obviously. External border control. EU helps its member countries in saving lives at sea, and this is a matter of fact, and in securing Europe's external borders. The Frontex agency is the agency of the European Union which coordinates the surveillance and risk analysis at the external borders. It cooperates with the member states, but it can represent a good start from where to build a truly European system of external border control. I would not say fighting, but limiting the level where the states can directly intervene on that. Schengen and internal borders, another policy which we described quite thoroughly during our today's webinar. And we can say that thanks to the border-free Schengen area, the EU countries' citizens and visitors can still move freely throughout the 26 participating countries. And this is the point where we should start from in order to realize one of the 5 scenarios I have described before. Preventing and fighting terrorism. Another policy which I already highlighted and reminded several times today. And it's all about coordinating national anti-terrorism forces, preventing radicalization, and conducting security research and crisis management. These are all aims of the EU. Much more should be done on that. But we can say that in respect to the end of the 90s, many steps ahead were done by the EU in this field. The same can be said for combating organized crime, another policy which is integral part of this security and borders approach, where the EU helps its member countries in combating crimes as human trafficking, online child abuse, cybercrime, trafficking in firearms, weapons, drugs. These are all sectors where the EU and the stricter cooperation can be extremely important and influential to tackle this specific matter. Okay, I'm going to briefly conclude today's webinar. Obviously, if there are questions, if you would like to highlight some points, I will leave a couple of minutes at the end of this presentation. And we can even foresee a couple of minutes if you want to discuss about this tomorrow, as we will have another webinar on economic and what are the scenarios related and foreseen by the white paper on economic integration of the EU. So what should be done? Obviously, this is a very difficult question to answer. What should be done depends on our perception of Europe, on how each of us individually sees the future of European integration, and on how far our politicians are willing to go in the process of European integration. This is not secondary. I mean, we citizens can have an influence, obviously, through electoral processes in what our politicians do. But at the very end, without a concrete and consistent political willingness to do things and to deepen the process of European integration, all what we are discussing about I would not say are empty words, but remain somehow in the clouds. So judging the efficiency and effectiveness of security and border management is extremely problematic in the globalized economy. So for economic operator, an efficient border management is the border management which allows him or her to have qualified workers to work in his company. For a state, an efficient border management guaranteeing the security of its own citizens is to limit as much as possible the entry in the country of organized crime, terrorists, and so on and so forth. So we cannot disregard the fact that increasing economic disparity between developing and first world countries, illegal immigration, transnational crimes, and terrorism are all interlinked. And all of these factors seriously undermine the capacity of the EU and its member states to control their borders. So all these 4 or 5 dimensions are connected. Economic disparity, and so growth, illegal immigration, transnational crime, terrorism, are all faces of the same cube, not coin in this case. In response, border control policies of European countries over the past decade have been only at a technical level, not at a political one, have emphasized the technical approaches. And the attention to security was given by a technical point of view. Cameras, visa identification system, all the technological innovation in border controls related to passports and so on and so forth are more technical solutions, which are not solving or tackling the more general problems which are behind immigrations and behind the need to ensure the security and the border control. So what is missing, in my opinion, is a clear and consistent governance agenda. Somehow the white paper is giving at a glance this approach, but still the member states are somehow hesitant, are somehow very cautious in making a step forward when it comes to governance instead of technical solutions. Let's see some specific trends in the regional securitization of border controls. These are just some tips. Obviously, there are many others, but these are just some tips to allow further discussions among you, to allow you to reflect on what has been said today, and especially to focus your attention on the fact that this is still a very much open field of cooperation among the states, and it's a field where we citizens can have a role, can have a word, can somehow influence and determine the political choices of our governments, and at the very end of EU institutions. First, there has been very scarce, scant attention, I would say, in public discourse given to the human rights of migrants. This is very often disregarded, but it's directly linked to security and borders management. Scarce attention to privacy issues. Again, privacy of EU citizens, this must be said, has been, is, and will be probably sacrificed in the name of security. Is this okay or not? A question we must answer it. Or there has been a very scarce attention to the need to balance perceived security considerations with democratic values. What comes first? Our democratic values, our idea of what freedom is, or perceived security considerations? I will make you an example. Recently in Italy, it has been said that by a well-known politician that more than half of the crimes are committed by migrants. And this is a scandal because migrants in Italy are about 10–11% of the population. So the security perception of Italian citizens was moved on the fact that migrants are criminals. If you go to look at the data of the Ministry of Interiors, you will see that only about 20% of the crimes are actually 2020, I think, data are committed by migrants or non-Italian citizens. So you see how the perception of security is very prone to political discourse, and you see how it's very important to deepen these aspects too. What is security perception for us? What do you intend for security? The second consideration, and I'm going to close, is that the EU has imposed border management policies to its neighbors. Is this correct? Is Serbia, Bosnia, Moldova, rather than Ukraine, are they supposed to respect EU rules only because the EU has imposed that? And the EU has used accession criteria, very strict criteria, the so-called conditionality, in the sense you will become a member of the EU only if you do this, this, and this, also on border and security, to candidate states. Just to get rid of the problem of managing its new external borders. It's a matter of fact. Think about the Balkan route. Think about what happened in Bosnia this winter and the winter before. Bosnia has been left alone in managing an extremely relevant human trafficking crisis. And finally, think about the fact that perhaps private sector companies like airlines, probably you travel as European citizens, are more and more involved in surveillance. Is that correct? Is this somehow again affecting our privacy, our rights as citizens? Which elements I have to say that these data will not be used for other purposes and so on and so forth. So you see, security governance is a very complex element. It's something that the EU should work on. It's something that the EU should develop its own level of integration, much more than on economics, as we will see. But it's something that is at the very core of the project of European Union we want to have for the future. Thank you for your attention. And obviously, I remain at disposal for questions or further clarifications even tomorrow. Thank you very much.
First of all, we thank you very much, Mr. Ezio Benedetti, for the excellent and complete presentation of the field security and borders. All points of the white paper have been analyzed and will be compared in the next workshop from the students. I ask to all, and especially to students, if they have any question on the matter. Okay, we confirm that webinar will be recorded and published on the dedicated YouTube channel. And I thank you everyone for being here today, and see you in the next webinar of economy, Mr. Ezio. No? Okay. Okay, thank you very much to all, and see you next time. Bye.